Depending on who does the survey and the way the question is framed, between 40 and 60% of contemporary Unitarian Universalists define themselves as humanists of some sort. So it's no surprise that, quote, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of mind and spirit, end quote. It's no surprise that this is explicitly mentioned as one of the sources of our living tradition. But the term humanist, like the term Christian, can mean very different things to different people. It can be used in several contrasting and even contradictory ways. Within the academic world, for example, the term humanist is generally used to describe someone who concentrates their studies in the humanities rather than the science, those who study literature, art, history, music, etc., as distinct from those scientists who study chemistry, physics, geology, mathematics, and so forth. Already in the 1950s, the British philosopher C.P. Snow spoke of two distinct cultures that did not understand each other's languages. In his influential framework, humanists were set against scientists. Obviously, the term is used very differently in our Unitarian Universalist sources, where humanism is virtually identified with scientific reasoning. It seeks to align itself with the results of science and with the scientific and technological progress as a whole. Science and technology taken together constitute what Robert Pirsig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, calls the Church of Reason. Like all churches, this one has its priesthood, its dogmas, and its heretics. It turns out that it also has its Vatican, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's what the historian William Irwin Thompson, who once taught there, called MIT, the Vatican of Engineering. Let me tell you a story about MIT. When I was a student at Harvard Divinity School way back in the 1970s, I served as an intern at the First Church of Boston, just across the Charles River from Cambridge. Usually I took the subway, the T, as they call it in Boston, to get back and forth. But one fine spring day, I was inspired to walk back along Massachusetts Avenue, which meant crossing the Harvard Bridge and proceeding past the campus of MIT on my way home. I was more than a little intimidated by this venerable institution. The students at MIT walked around with calculators dangling from their belts in little leather holsters. This was in the era after slide rules, but before handheld computers. And they wore these little holsters as if prepared to challenge one another to calculating contests or digital duels like high-tech cowboys. All right, stranger, step back 10 paces and calculate. So walking past the MIT campus without a calculator was like walking into Dodge City without a six-shooter. It was a tough neighborhood, and I was half expecting to be challenged by someone demanding to see my SAT scores, especially the math scores. Anyway, to get there, I had to first cross over the Harvard Bridge. It was a beautiful spring day, and I was enjoying the sights and the smells and the sounds that surrounded me, the salt breeze, the squawking seagulls swooping low, the delicate skulls skimming the surface of the Charles River like giant water bugs. And high above in the heavens, the clouds were reflected in the tall blue glass of the John Hancock Tower, which was itself in turn reflected in the tidal basin below. Even the traffic noise sounded somehow musical. Everything was in its place, circling around the hub of the universe. And in the middle of this reverie, I happened to look down at the pavement beneath my feet, and I saw something very unusual. Painted on the sidewalk was a thick red line and the cryptic notation, 10 smoots. I had no idea what that meant, and I puzzled over it as I walked along. And about 50 feet or so further, there was another mark with the inscription, 20 smoots. And so it went across the bridge, 30 smoots, 40 smoots, 50, 60, 70, until at the far footing of the bridge was the final notation, 364.4 smoots plus 1 ear. I was intrigued and asked around until I learned the story behind these mysterious markings. It turns out that in 1958, a young MIT student named Oliver Smoot Jr. was trying to get into the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. And during an inspired and probably beer-soaked initiation ritual, his 5'7" frame was used as a human measuring device. One October evening, he was tipped and toppled over the bridge by his pledge brothers, while his upper classmates marked the progress with paintbrushes. Now, far from viewing this brushwork as unwanted graffiti, the police department came to accept these markings, even using them over the years to pinpoint locations when they were filling out traffic accident reports. And in the late 1980s, when the bridge was entirely rebuilt, these markings mysteriously reappeared. So if you go there now, you'll see them, along with a plaque that solemnly declares that the smoot has joined the angstrom, the meter, and the light year as an accepted unit of measure, all because of this strange scientific experiment. Now, this is not, I think, what the ancient Greek philosopher meant when he said that man is the measure of all things. Nor do I think it's what Jesus had in mind when he said, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. I think they intended something more profound and meaningful, but I think the story of the bridge is meaningful in its own way, and we'll come back to it later. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the place of human beings in the cosmos according to traditional religious thought, what some people call the perennial philosophy. In this traditional view, human beings occupy a middle realm between the celestial and the terrestrial world, between the macrocosm and the microcosm, if you will. Human beings form a kind of bridge between these realms, standing in what the religious scholar Houston Smith calls the mesocosm. The meso means middle in Greek, as in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, or Mesoamerica, Central America. So meso means the middle. According to traditional worldview, this mesocosm is the space properly occupied by human beings. In Norse mythology, it's called Midgard, the inspiration for Tolkien's Middle Earth. It was there in the words of our opening hymn, "We are the earth upright and proud." We are proud, and rightly so, of human powers and potentials and accomplishments. Think of the reading from Sophocles, already thousands of years ago. And yet, we are also aware of our humble earthly origin. We are the earth. We are upright and proud, but we are also the earth. Adam from Adamah in the Hebrew story, formed out of common clay, animated by the divine breath. Now, I think there's a powerful creative tension built into this worldview. It's well illustrated, I think, in a teaching from the Hasidic tradition within Judaism. Everyone should have 2 papers, one in each pocket, so that you can reach into the one or the other according to your needs. On the slip in the right pocket are written the words, "For my sake, the entire world was created." And on the slip in the other pocket, "I am but dust and ashes." Both of those statements are true. We participate in both of those worlds, and it's the creative tension between those two truths that gives human life its unique dynamism and pathos. Now, as I said, this is the traditional view, sometimes imagined as a great hierarchy consisting of levels of being, some of which are qualitatively more real than others, and qualitatively more real than where we happen to be standing. There are also levels that have less being, that are, if you will, less real than this world. The heavenly realms are saturated with goodness, truth, and beauty. The underworld is a world of shadows, lacking reality, not so much evil as insubstantial, gradually fading away into nothingness. So according to this traditional view, human beings reside at the very center of the universe. But don't misunderstand that. Being at the center is very different from being in the highest place. The center is like Goldilocks, not too high, not too low, but just right. Human beings in this traditional view are most definitely not at the top of the heap. Far from it. We're in the middle. Human beings are seen as bridges between these worlds, whose cosmic vocation, our cosmic vocation, is to be bridge makers, bridge builders, pontiffs, to use the Latin term, pontiffs, bridges, bridge makers. This, think of the bridge over the Charles River. This traditional way of thinking was completely overturned and destroyed by the scientific revolution of the 17th century. That's a familiar story, and I don't need to rehearse it here, except to say that the world that we all live in today was created and shaped by that revolution. But, as Houston Smith points out, we still live in the middle of what is in effect a three-story cosmos with a world above and a world below. It's simply that qualitative measures have been replaced by quantitative ones. Scientists look out into the farthest reaches of space and weigh and measure the most distant stars using the powerful mathematical tools and instruments at their disposal. And similarly, turning their gaze in the other direction, they uncover a world of infinitesimal scale and incredible complexity. There's a wonderful video dating back to 1977 called Powers of 10. I don't know if you've seen that. I highly recommend it. It was too long to show today, but it begins with an overhead view of a couple enjoying a picnic taken from about 10 meters above them. And then the camera zooms out each jump by a power of 10. So it's 100 meters higher, and you see the grass around them, and another leap, and we see this, oh, this is Grant Park in Chicago. I recognize that. And it goes higher and higher and go out to the outer limits of the known universe, and then turns back and goes back down, closer and closer, until it, focuses on one of the person's hands and then plunges into the subatomic world just as far in the other direction. It's an amazing film. And actually, do we have an image of it's not the same, but I came across this image used by Joel Premack, who's a distinguished professor of physics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's an image of the Ouroboros. It's actually not unlike this. It's a circular image. Maybe we can put that up on the screen. This is Premack's attempt to kind of illustrate this is where human beings hang out in this at this scale, and then as you get progressively larger level of solar system, galaxies, and so on, to the furthest extent, 10 to the 30th centimeters, the furthest expanse that physicists can imagine. And then in the other direction, again, through cells and DNA and so on, molecules and atoms, and to the tiniest possible scale of size. And human beings are basically right in the middle of that. That's his point. That based on these quantitative measures of scale, this is where we are. We're still in the middle. Okay, thank you for that. But the measure is quantitative rather than qualitative. And the challenge, I think, for us in this age is to reintegrate a sense of qualitative measure into our lives, to integrate what that means to be qualitative bridge builders, if you will. Human beings, through the use of scientific reason, have unlocked the secrets of nature and released tremendous powers for good or ill. The vision of Sophocles has unfolded beyond the wildest dreams of our ancestors. In the powerful poetry of the book of Job, God challenges his human protagonist with the rhetorical question, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time that they give birth when they crouch to give birth to their offspring and are delivered of their young? Job was stunned speechless, but the modern, scientifically minded person, a wildlife biologist, let's say, from the University of Wisconsin, would simply respond, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, we do know. We have that data, and we know that and a lot more than that. And we know it so well that we can pretty much predict and control it in the world and reproduce it in the lab. Thank you very much. But I don't think God's question was really, can you dominate and manipulate the other creatures? Can you re-engineer their DNA code or whatever? But rather, the voice from the whirlwind was challenging Job to a deeper insight. Can human beings see themselves and understand themselves as belonging and participating as members of this amazing earth community that includes such marvelous creatures who are valuable in their own, valuable and beloved in their own right? The proper goals of religion, I think, are participation and communion. The language of religion is the language of promise and commitment, and its appropriate standard of measure is qualitative. The goals of science and technology, on the other hand, are prediction and control. The language of science is the abstract and analytical language of mathematics, of number, and its standard of measure is properly quantitative. So there's nothing wrong with either of those languages, but problems can arise when users claim that their language is the only legitimate one. Like William Irwin Thompson, Houston Smith also taught at MIT in the humanities department. Apparently everything that isn't science was kind of lumped together in humanities. So Smith tells the story of having lunch one day at the faculty club and finding himself seated next to a scientist. And as often happened in such circumstances, he writes, the conversation turned to differences between science and the humanities. We were getting nowhere when suddenly my conversation partner interrupted what I was saying with the authority of a man who had discovered truth. I have it, he exclaimed. The difference between us is that I count and you don't. Now, encapsulated in that neat double entendre, we see the difference between science, which is a legitimate and powerful human activity, and what Smith calls scientism, an ideology that makes of science itself an unquestionable idol. Despite its undeniable power, the modern scientific perspective represents a flattening of the qualitative depth dimension which characterized the traditional worldview. It requires a kind of tunnel vision which excludes from its view a great deal that matters to human beings, things like values, purposes, life meanings, and the qualitative appreciation of moral and aesthetic value. Science deals with instrumental values, but not intrinsic ones. Science can describe what human beings do value, but it cannot prescribe what we ought to value. Economics, to the extent that it strives to be a hard science, and it clearly wants to be seen as such, economics is a good example of that. It can tell us, in fact, and in painstaking empirical detail, what we do, in fact, value as measured in monetary terms, quantitatively, but not what we ought to value Economics simply cannot provide that. Neither can science pursue questions of purpose in a way that human beings require. The Nobel Prize-winning biologist Jacques Monod asserts that the very cornerstone of the scientific method is the systematic denial that true knowledge can be gotten at by interpreting phenomena in terms of final causes, that is, in terms of purpose. So science systematically and rigorously excludes questions of purpose from its view. It's fine to be clear about that methodologically, but then to say that there's no such thing as purpose is to take the step from science to scientism. Stephen Weinberg, the Nobel Prize-winning astrophysicist, said that the more the universe seems scientifically comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. We live in what the philosopher Ken Wilber calls a disqualified universe. It has been bleached of its qualities, and we are left with the quantities. As human beings, of course, scientists can and do engage in questions about the meaning of life, but strictly speaking, at that point, they're not wearing their scientist hat when they do that. The difference between science and scientism is that scientism claims it is the only way. There's only one kind of entity in the world, and that is the kind studied by natural scientists. And second, that there's only one kind of knowledge in the world, and that is the kind natural scientists have. The problem here, as the psychologist Abraham Maslow put it, is that when the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to treat everything as a nail. And that holds true even if the hammer is an incredibly sophisticated and exquisitely delicate instrument. What is lacking in the scientistic worldview are precisely the qualities of humility and of humor. And this is where I want to return to the story on the bridge. When the students, all of them aspiring scientists, used Oliver Smoot as a yardstick, they acted in good humor, as did he, and that very act allowed them to transcend a narrow scientific perspective. Our true humanity so often shines through creatively in moments of humor and realization of humility. Both of those words, humor and humility, are etymologically related, of course, to each other and to the word human, a word which both you and I cherish. To approach truth humanly, we would do well to retain for ourselves a good bit of humility before the mystery of being, which is the source of inspiration for both art and science, reason and faith. The scientific goal of prediction and control is entirely appropriate in its own domain. I do want the pilot flying an airplane that I'm on to be able to predict its course and to control its flight, and to understand the science and engineering behind it. But beyond prediction and control, the truly human life includes, and I think requires, goals such as participation and promise and commitment and communion, all measured, if we can measure them at all, in qualitative terms. Now, this is the reason for religious communities, places where we can share and celebrate the stories, the symbols, the questions, and the commitments that give meaning and purpose to our lives. I like to say that if math is the language of science, then myth is the language of religion. Not myth in the sense of false narrative, which is often misunderstood to mean, but myth is in the sense of the big stories that tell the essential truths. Mythical language gives access to that qualitative dimension of human life, of reality, which is untouched by the objectifying and quantifying approach of science. Unfortunately, many of us suffer from a kind of mythic illiteracy and inability to understand how symbolic and metaphorical and poetic language works. Stephen Hawking once said dismissively that mysticism is for those who can't do the math. And with all due respect to his genius, I would say in response that scientism, not science, but scientism, is for those who can't do the myth. those who are tone deaf to those that register of human communication. My beloved mentor, James Luther Adams, taught that the sole purpose of religion is to help us become more human. He wrote a book entitled On Being Human Religiously. Becoming human is the end, the goal, the purpose of life. Becoming human. Religious belief and practice may help us become human, more human. They may be the means to that end, in which case religion is to be embraced and affirmed and used. To the extent that religion gets in the way of that end of becoming human, it must be criticized and either transformed or rejected. The purpose of life is always to be more human, not more religious. The early Christian theologian Irenaeus of Lyon famously said that the glory of God is a human being who is fully alive. To be truly human, to live this holy human life means to stretch ourselves to the full measure of being, like that Vitruvian man I had on the announcement for this sermon. Perhaps we can take Oliver Smoot as a model after all and realize that we are all laying out our lives as bridge builders, connecting our experiences within and across communities and cultures. We live in a world, a troubled world, but a world that is filled with meaning and purpose and quality and value, as well as a world that is subject in many ways to our knowledge and even to our control. We stand today where we have always stood, in the middle, in the mesocosm, spanning heaven and earth, as bridge-building, value-bearing, and meaning-making creatures. Here on the paths of every day, here on the common human way. So I'm going to stop there.